going to be doing, tonight we're sharing about coping with anxiety and fear. And a lot of people are doing things like this today because of COVID-19, but this is good for all kinds of problems. Anxiety is one of our #1 problems in the United States. And we're going to be looking at it with a different perspective, the neurodevelopmental perspective, which is sensory-motor-reflex connections. And there's more tools there than most people understand. This is a pretty simple presentation, but I hope that then we can have some questions about this. So I just want everyone to understand what neurodevelopment is. It is looking at the sensory processing, both our conscious processing, but also a lot of unconscious processing. Also, the motor reactions to those sensory processes, which are both conscious and unconscious. So we have a lot going on with our sensory-motor loop. And here we're going to be talking about feelings versus emotions. Now, feelings is something, it's a word, it's a very interesting word because we feel things in our body, and then we abstract them into thoughts, which are emotions. And we talk about them as if they're things. I call it in English thingifying things. We thingify things. We put the word on it and it puts it in a box kind of, but that's not really the way feelings are. They are going through our body and they're trying to give communication to our to our entire system, to our conscious and unconscious parts of us. So words have a history, and I always like to bring this up because fright comes from a word that means trembling. So it's a body state. You're trembling, you know you had fright. You see? So in other words, body states were really the way we originally talked about emotions, but then later on we got away from that. Worry, the word worry comes from the root word, comes from the word to strangle. So anxiety and worry feel like they're strangling you. It's actually a tension that comes in your core, your throat, and other parts of you. So really, emotions are mental abstractions of those physical feelings. So we put names on those feelings, but as you can see with these little faces, it's very easy to show. You could recognize these emotions just through these little stick figures, and because we have an ability in our brain to see other people's emotions and actually feel those emotions in our body through what we're seeing. And sometimes it's facial expression, sometimes that's body posture and other ways. And being aware of this is important for anxiety because understanding that the feeling of anxiety, as unpleasant as it is really just a feeling, is part of the cure for getting away from it. In other words, when we feel things, they are just in our body, they're a message. They are a message telling us something. So what are they trying to tell us? Okay. So what is anxiety exactly? The definition that is usually, very casual definition is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease. Typically about an imminent event or something that of an uncertain outcome. So sort of a worry, right? And that's what we think about it in a casual way. But there's also a clinical definition. But before we get on to that clinical definition, I want to give a tip. I like to give tips throughout my talks, and this one is, believe it or not, faking an emotion on your face can actually make you feel more like that emotion. So sometimes just putting on a happy face, as they say in the song, can actually help. It doesn't mean that you're being a fake when you do it. You are just trying to encourage your body to feel the state of the happy you're feeling, the happier emotion. Another part of this is looking up. Believe it or not, they've done studies that show that when people look up, they feel better. As a matter of fact, I used to do this as a teacher. When a child was crying, I would go, "Oh, look at that bird up there," and the child would look up, and they would stop crying. It's almost impossible to cry while you're looking up. You have to look down. So when you're feeling sad, you're downcast. Your eyes are cast downward, and when things are looking up, things are getting better. So looking up can really help you. Higher spaces make you feel better. So here's your more casual idea of anxiety, someone having a test, feeling under pressure, feeling expectations. These can all add to a feeling of anxiety. But the psychiatric definition of anxiety is a nervous disorder, which is characterized by a state of excessive unease and apprehension. typically with some compulsive behavior or panic attacks. Now, as a person who's had panic attacks myself in the past, before I found this work, I can tell you, they feel so real, and you are so in such a state. But one of the things that helped me get out of the state of a panic attack was realizing that it was just a feeling in my body, that it was not going to kill me, that although I felt very, very frightened, that it was just my body's reaction to something. And I was able over time to really start to begin my healing process. And it took me many years, and that's one reason I do these seminars, is because I did have a lot of those problems. So anxiety is a feeling that can become a disorder by triggering unwanted behavior from the lower brain. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means as we go on here. Here's a nice brain, and you can see the yellow part is the lower brain, which I conclude the brain stem and the cerebellum. The midbrain is the part in pink, and that's kind of what we think about as our emotional seat, but really it is the transformer, I guess I would call it. It's what comes in through the body, transforms into an emotional state through that midbrain area, and up into the blue brain, which is the thinking brain, the logical brain. So as an example, you might see a mouse, okay, in your house, and it may startle you, and you're startled before you can even think about it. That's the low brain immediately reacting to something that's going on in the environment. And it goes up into the midbrain, and the midbrain goes, oh my gosh, what is that? And there's a great fear from the amygdala area, and a memory probably of what mice are and why you don't want them in your house. And then that goes up into the upper brain that goes, oh, wait a minute, that's a mouse. I don't need to be afraid of that little thing. I can take care of this, right? I need to get those traps out or whatever I'm going to do to get rid of that mouse. So this is how our brain works. And a lot of it is unconscious, going into the conscious. And that's an important thing to remember about anxiety, is when we feel it, it's a message. It is a message. It in of itself is not really a thing. It's trying to tell you something. Something's going on in the body-brain system, in the neurodevelopmental system, that needs to be addressed. Here's an example. Here's a real brain scan. And you can see the lower part of it. This is looking straight on, like you're looking into someone's face. Down, you'll see the lower part is the lower brain, the midbrain, and then the upper brain, where it splits into two. You'll see how bright it is in the lower part, because everything comes into that lower brain, but you're not conscious of all of that. It helps sort it out, buffer it, and take care of it before you're even conscious of it. And a lot of times our intuition or feeling that something's going on is something coming out of that lower brain. Now, the lower brain doesn't think in words. It thinks in impulses and reactions that helps go to the midbrain to trigger a feeling a feeling. So really a lot of things that happen in our body and brain when we have anxiety start at a lower level. We might not even know why we're having that feeling of anxiety. As a matter of fact, people will often think, well, I feel anxious. It must be this or that. I must be feeling anxious about tomorrow's test. Maybe that's not even why, but the upper brain likes reasons, and it's going to give a reason to everything. Whether it's the right reason or not, we don't know. So anxiety is a feeling. It's a message from the lower brain. It's a symptom. Some nervous systems are more susceptible due to genetics or trauma, or both. Now, having been a person who had a genetically, my disposition genetically is very highly strung, right? That's where I come out of. And I had trauma. I had a birth trauma. So between the two of those things, I had a very more likelihood of having panic attacks, anxiety, and fear in my life. It was just absolutely there. And it took time to discover how I could use my genetics in a positive way and how I could deal with the trauma that had affected me and the rest of me. So traumas are really the thing that enters into the world, everyone's world. Everyone has trauma of some sort. Now, trauma, some people think trauma has to be something like near death before it's a trauma. It does not. Sometimes just sudden changes, sudden shocks things going on can be traumatic. And we have learned a lot about how trauma just can really flip switches in our brain and body that we really don't have control over. You can be very unconscious. So finding out, you may not even know what your trauma is, so sometimes that's not even that important, but it's good to understand that there are physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual roots to trauma, and understanding those can help us begin to heal ourselves. A lot of people think trauma and fears come out of emotions only, but they don't. They come out of all these roots. And understanding that and be able to work at them one at a time in their own way is really the way to put towards healing. So physical trauma can come in utero, it can come at birth, after birth, childhood, young adulthood, or adulthood. It can happen any time in life, but the earlier the trauma happens, the more it's going to affect your physical development going forward. So like I had a at-birth trauma, right? And so that affected my after birth, my babyhood, my childhood, my young adulthood until I became aware of it. But, you know, we have traumas in later age as well. But what happens sometimes is those later traumas can piggyback on the earlier trauma, causing even more problems. So this is all about trying to get to the root of the most stable, sustainable, resilient system we can get. And neurodevelopment can help with that. Mental and emotional trauma are triggering, and they tend to get you thinking about something, and so you're associating with it. And then we see a looping into physical responses. So you might see somebody, like even somebody with OCD, they think of something and then they have to do something. Now that's an extreme example of this sort of thing. So I get anxious and I have to wash my hands. I get anxious, I have to wash my hands. I have to, you know, this is a feedback loop. And the person knows in their upper brain that they should not be doing it. They want to stop doing it, but because the midbrain and the lower brain are in such a state of trauma, the upper brain cannot by themselves usually calm it. But understanding how to disconnect these loops is the beginning of healing trauma. And that's part of what we do. It sounds very psychological, but it's really often very physical. Spiritual terms, the reason I bring in spiritual trauma, because I really think our society's in a meaning crisis. I really do. There's a lot of young people who feel nihilism, which means no meaning. A lot of people get into legalism, so they're seeing rules, like maybe a certain religious groups might see rules only. If I just follow all the rules, I'll be okay, you know. And a lot of people misuse religion and spirituality, and they're not really, and these can all cause or be at least an end result of trauma, anxiety, and fear. So we're going to look at the sensory motor, and I like this little chart because it shows the seminal senses are the senses that you're born with. All in utero, we develop all of our senses before we're born, but they're not really fully formed until after birth. The reflex movements are also developed in utero, but after birth, or getting through the birth experience, many of these reflexes change and adapt and help our senses. So the senses trigger motor reactions, and the motor reactions help develop the sensory input. So this is what we call the sensory-motor feedback system. Most people know the 5 outer senses: smell, taste, touch, vision, and hearing. I don't think we need to go into those, but a lot of people don't know about the inner senses. Okay, the first inner sense I want to talk about is the gravity sense, and that is the sense of working against gravity. Most people don't think about it, but you are dealing with gravity every second of your life. If you didn't work with gravity, you would just be a puddle on the ground, because you have to push against gravity just to sit up. You have to move through gravity just to walk. You can feel it on you, heavy. Sometimes I tell people, think about when you've been in a swimming pool and you get out of the swimming pool